Do what thou wilt should be the whole of the law. Welcome, everybody. We're going to do allegory and symbol today. And our text is on the Cave of the Nymphs by Porphyry. This is a moderately well-known text in early modernity, and it's not so well known anymore. And I think that's due to the decline of what we might call the bourgeois classical education that used to be the case for most members of the educated classes in European culture, certainly in the 19th century and also a little bit in the early 20th century. And in the post-war period, this is increasingly subsumed to commercialized alienation. I don't know. You could look at what Theodor Adorno has to say about this, but anyway, what I want to talk about this week is the theurgy part of Crowley's methodology, skeptical theurgy. So if we recall in the Equinox, there's this idea that the methodology of magic is what he calls Pyrrhic Zoroastrianism, which can be more or less translated as skeptical theurgy. And last week we talked about the Pyrrhic part of that is related to the traditions of academic empiric skepticism. But this week, I want to emphasize more the theurgy part of that methodological conjunction. So the ideal is that the magician is supposed to be practicing skepticism and theurgy together. Okay, well, we talked about skepticism as related to the epoche, the bracketing of experience, where you're in a space of openness, empirical questioning towards the phenomenon that you're encountering. But then what kind of phenomenon are we supposed to be encountering and how do we generate that? So I guess another way of framing this question would be ask, what is the great magical agent or agency, the means whereby magic is something we can practice as human beings? And I would propose that from a modern point of view, which is the philosophical viewpoint that I'm approaching these issues from in this course, language, semiotics, is the great magical agent that permits magic to be a phenomenon that human beings can experience. Another way to put this is, you all know that there's this philosopher named Hegel who's big into this thing called the dialectic, and that then becomes this big theme for philosophy in modern times. So along with maybe the word hermeneutics, and there's a few other words that seem like these big complicated philosophical terms. Existential. Existential just means you exist as a human being. So here we are, we're existing, we're inquiring into what that means. That's all ultimately existentialism means. It's this big, scary technical term, but it turns out that it actually has this very straightforward meaning. Same is the case for hermeneutics and dialectic. Hermeneutics just means to interpret things. When you read a text and you're interpreting it as you read it and understand it, the understanding of that understanding is called hermeneutics. Likewise, the study of language and the way we use language to cognitively construct our world experience as human beings and to interact and relate to other human beings in a shared space of social reflection and interaction, a kind of shared social life world, that can be called the dialectic, because dialectic just means language. And it's just a fancy word meaning language or discourse. It's just the Greek word for that. So basically what I want to talk about is the idea of what in German idealism is called the transcendental turn in philosophy. So from a kind of common sense empirical viewpoint of what we might call naive realism, from that point of view, it seems that we show up having this thing called consciousness, and then we're just kind of objectively there, and we have this objective experience of things around us that are objectively separate from us. And as a subject, we're separate from those objects, and as objects, they're separate from our subjectivity. And there's just these two separate things. And then this thing called naive realism happens, where I just see things in front of me and I know what they are. And that's the truth. And philosophy begins when we begin to have skepticism towards that set of assumptions. And in the philosopher Immanuel Kant, particularly in his work, The Critique of Pure Reason, he argued that the only reason we can have experience of a sensory world is if in us, psychologically, we already have these categories that structure our experience cognitively, such that we're able to then experience such a thing as, say, objects that exist separate from us in space and time. This goes forward further in Freudian psychoanalysis, where there's this thing called object theory, with people like Melanie Klein and others, where the socialization that we experience in terms of language permits us to experience ourselves as a psychological subject separate from our experienced world. And so for the not yet linguistically fully socialized baby, they would experience, for example, when they're suckling on the teat, they would not experience their mother as necessary, and the enjoyment they're experiencing with their mother is separate from them, in the sense that they wouldn't differentiate the mother as a separate being socially from them. You have to learn these language categories before you're able to do that. So that means that the world that we experience, objectivity is really based on a kind of subjectivity, and vice versa. Our subjectivity is based on a certain objectivity, namely shared social language uses that are imported into us. And the psychoanalyst and philosopher Jacques Lacan calls this imprinting of the symbolic matrix of language usages that we learn when we learn to speak and be a speaking subject. He calls this the imaginary. So that's not to be distinguished from the imagination. The imagination is the faculty we have to generate mental images, but the matrix of language and symbolic usages that provides the form or structure of those images such that we're able to make them, Lacan calls the imaginary. Now, these are all terms pregnant with magical usage, because it turns out that if language undergirds our ability to experience the world, then by using language, we can self-reflexively make a kind of loop with ourselves. This is sometimes called the hermeneutical circle. My old magical teacher, Ebony Ampu, sometimes referred to this as making a magical link with yourself, or causing a strange loop in space-time in the magical universe that you're part of, so that by casting a spell means to spell with letters, like with language, and we use grimoires, which means a grammar, which is just, we're using language when we use magic to deploy symbolism, to then reprogram ourselves so that we're then able to change our experience, sometimes extremely radically. This also allows us to get access to a kind of visionary potential through the use of the imagination as programmed by the imaginary, which we can reprogram through magic. We're able to have these creative visions poetically, through entertainment like novels, storytelling, even just the anecdotes that we tell to each other about ourselves and others, that we can very radically change and affect our social experience. And all of this is alienated, this power that we have as human beings to be magical beings who can work magic, um, is alienated from us by the vulgarity of commercial mass media culture, what Marxists call commodity reification, as a kind of social leveling off of our potential. And so magic, I think, allows us to resacralize, is a route to enable us to resacralize our experience and discover that we always already were in a kind of innately magical experience, field of experience, that we can reclaim our ability to interact with in a very complicated way. But if language is the way that we do that, then we need to try to understand how the semiotic structure of magic works. And the most basic tool to understand that is this thing called signification. And signification works through this basic mechanism called metaphor, in which one thing stands for or means something else, not necessarily in virtue of any particular features or qualities that the thing that's the indicator, that's the sign or signifier has. The relation between signifier and signified, between sign and the meaning of that sign, is in a sense arbitrary. We make that connection occur through magical will to power, through the historically contingent and human constructed and produced form of the imaginary, that then in turn is the form, the semiotic structure underlying our faculty of the imagination. And so as we're climbing up the tree of life, remember, we go from Malkut to Yesod, Yesod being the place of the so-called astral plane, where we can gain access to these imaginative visions. That's just another way of talking about, in my opinion, this way that we can reappropriate back these alienated valences of the magical imagination. And the primary vehicle for that in modern times is something called symbolism, which is the primary mode of what we're deploying in magical ritual. We're using symbols to communicate a certain type of esoteric gnosis or understanding to ourselves. And what's interesting about symbolism is that it's based on a more ancient, also explicitly magical, theurgic mode called allegory or allegoresis. And it's something that was, I can't really say, we're going to be looking at a Greek philosophical text where in Greek philosophy, that this is the mode of their rhetoric becomes explicit to them in their discourse because of philosophy. But I do want to emphasize that this metaphor is basic to language itself. And so all cultures use allegory when they tell stories or have myths. All myths are innately, in some sense, social allegories. They reflect tensions and issues of the societies that have these as their mythologies. Now that can be more or less thematically coherent at the level of philosophy. So it's useful to look at the Greek usage of this. Obviously, the Bible, for example, the Hebrew scriptures are saturated in allegory and metaphor. Part of the reason too that we're looking at this Greek text on the Cave of the Nymphs is that I was chagrined when I was at the Graduate Theological Union getting my various graduate degrees. One of the professors there, who's a very fine fellow, by the way, had this rather preposterous claim that he thought that Christians had invented allegory, and that it was medieval Christians doing exegesis of the Hebrew scriptures, and that they've somehow made this huge discovery that they didn't have to interpret the so-called Old Testament in terms of halakhic observance or in terms of the national myth of the history of ancient Palestine or whatever, Judea, the history of those ancient kingdoms and people. And that instead they could discover that everything in the Old Testament was a symbol for, or an allegory for a type of Christ, and that this was some great accomplishment, was the discovery of allegory. And of course, obviously, the Greek pagans and the rabbis were totally aware of this before, already in antiquity, before the Christians come along and they learn this from Philo or Porphyry or whoever, and then Augustine comes along and he's like, oh yeah, I figured out from the bishop Cyprian that the Hebrew scriptures can be interpreted allegorically, so we don't have to, like, as Christians, we don't have to stop reading the Hebrew scriptures and just read the New Testament. We can still find relevance in these texts. Okay, well, kind of in a way, whoop-de-doo, because this was already a basic theme of Neoplatonic rhetoric and the type of intensive exegesis that was already going on in the Jewish Hellenic community. I mentioned Philo, but there's a number of other figures where there's this whole Alexandrian school of Jewish exegesis of their own scriptures in terms of a kind of Stoic Platonism. So Philo wrote an interesting work called The Life of Moses, in which he interprets Moses as the ideal, like, Stoic philosopher. And he's got how the Mosaic law can be interpreted to develop all these, the standard tropes of pagan virtue straight out of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics or whatever. So this is a kind of common philosophical notion that then gets further developed in modernity that we'll talk about in a moment, into what we would now call symbol, but in ancient times was called allegory. The term allegoresis is a cognate term. Okay, so let's take a look at the Cave of the Nymphs. So let me share my screen. Okay, great. So, Joseph, would you be so good as to read this bit that's indented, which is a quotation from Homer's The Odyssey that's now going to be interpreted esoterically by Porphyry. If you could read that little bit from Homer.
Sure. High at the head of branching olive groves and crowns the pointed cliffs with shady boughs, a cavern pleasant though involved in night, beneath it lies Naiades' delight, where bowls and urns of workmanship divine and massy beams in native marble shine, on which the nymphs amazing webs display of purple hue exquisite array. The busy bees within the urn secure honey delicious and like nectar pure. Perpetual waters through the grotto glide. A lofty gate unfolds on either side. That to the north is pervious to mankind. The sacred south to immortals is consigned.
Okay, great. Thank you. So the basic idea of allegory is that it's a way of interpreting the esoteric meaning of particular passages, in this case from Homer. And usually what Neoplatonists will do, oh yes, let me first introduce Porphyry. Porphyry is part of our primary lineage of Neoplatonic philosophers in the late Roman Empire. And this is a lineage that basically runs from a fellow by the name of Plotinus that we're going to look at in 2 weeks. And then his successor was a fellow by the name of Porphyry, and this is a text by him. Porphyry was also the editor of a kind of collected discourses of Plotinus by the name of the Enneads. We're going to look at that text later. But he also wrote a number of other texts of his own, most of which have been lost, but there's a few surviving shorter texts, of which this is an example that are complete. And then Porphyry's successor was someone by the name of Iamblichus, who is Syrian. And then a little bit later on, after the collapse of the Roman Empire, there's a further philosopher who lived in Asia Minor, and his name was Proclus. And he's kind of the last great pagan philosopher that Christianity had already become the official religion of the Roman Empire, and paganism was progressively becoming illegal to practice. But Proclus is one of the last practitioners of a pagan Neoplatonism. And then after that, there is the continuation of a kind of Platonic mysticism, but it's now absorbed within Christianity, or it appears in different modes of Sufism in Islam, or it's been absorbed into Kabbalistic speculation in rabbinical literature, and is now being practiced as a kind of Kabbalistic, mystical, and magical praxis within the Jewish community. So this is a text that's situated within a Neoplatonic mystical tradition where its practitioners see themselves as initiates of mysteries, and that the secret of pagan religion is represented by the mythologies that they've inherited, particularly in Homer. The meaning or significance of those myths is to be found in Platonic theology. So basically, then, how that relates to allegory is that the way that allegory works is there's going to be a basically one-to-one correspondence between the details of how Homer describes what's in this cave. And what Porphyry is going to do is he's going to interpret the meaning of each of these elements in terms of how they demonstrate some detail about Neoplatonic philosophy and its way of interpreting the world. And then he's going to claim that since Homer, he imagines, was also an initiate of the ancient mysteries, including Plato and Pythagoras and Orpheus and Mithras and Hermes Trismegistus and a number of ancient figures that he sees as a more or less coherent tradition of ancient initiation that he's then the inheritor of, and that what he's done is historically interpreted all of their teachings in terms of Platonism. And then that's the key to the mysteries. That allows him to interpret allegorically all the things that go on in these myths to read off these virtuous doctrines of Platonism. So the first element of the allegory is that the cave of the Nymphs, this cave in the island of Ithaca that's being poetically described by Homer, that's a metaphor for the cosmos. So let's go to page 30 where he writes a little bit about that. So the idea is this cave has all this water flowing through it. And so Porphyry is going to interpret that to mean that the water are the supernatural forms that flow in and through the prime matter to then inform that matter with its form. And so it's the fusing of form and matter to give rise to the world. So if you see where my cursor is, there on page 30 to the left there, about halfway through the page, it says, through matter, therefore, the world is obscure and dark. So the cave is underground and dark. But through the connecting power and orderly distribution of form, the waters that flow as the tides ebb and flow through the cavern, from which also it is called world, it is beautiful and delightful. Hence, it may very properly be denominated as a cave, as being lovely indeed to him who first enters into it through its participation of forms. Remember, matter participates in the supernatural realm of forms, and this creates that infusion of spirit into matter, even though spirit properly is otherworldly in another dimension, but that through our form, and particularly through the form of our rational minds, human beings participate in this other spiritual domain, and understanding that this is the case provides a kind of Gnostic salvation. It's a kind of soteriological function, is understanding this philosophy, because then you possess the gnosis that you're a spiritual being, that you're not just a material body that's subject to transformation and death, but that you participate in a dimension that's beyond space and time. Okay, and then on the facing page, actually, though, let me start down at the bottom here. He says, thus also the Persians, mystically signifying the descent of the soul into the sublunary regions, the world below the sphere of the moon, and its regression from it, meaning its return to the extra-cosmic domain, because when it knows that it's a spiritual being, when it dies, it doesn't reincarnate and become remixed with matter. It can ascend upward through the spheres of the heavens, and depending on its level of philosophical purification, it can potentially reunite with the pure spirit that's beyond the sphere of the fixed stars. So he's talking about what he calls the mysteries of the Persians. Okay, when he talks about Persians here, he doesn't actually mean literal Persians, people living in Persia at this time. What he's referring to instead are what's called the Mithraic mysteries, which are an initiatory cult, one of the mystery religions that were quite prominent in the Middle and later Roman Empire. And a lot of people in the Roman army were particularly initiates in this, just like later. A more modern example would be during the American Revolutionary War. There was significant involvement of American revolutionary army units having a kind of club that when you enlisted in that unit, you were also initiated into a Masonic lodge of Freemasonry that all the members of that military unit were part of. And so in virtue of joining being enrolled in the unit, they were all also part of this Masonic club. And in a similar way, Roman military units often were all initiates of the Mithraic mysteries as a way to like build a spirit de corps within their within the culture of being part of the army, basically. One of the most famous details about the Mithraic mysteries is that their initiation rituals were done in these special caves that are called Mithraisms. Anyway, there's these caves, these grottos that have these frescoes and pictures on them. There's a whole bunch of these that survive in Europe, and they're underground. And you go under the ground, and that's where they have their initiation ceremony. So that's what Porphyry is talking about here. He says, thus also the Persians, mystically signifying the descent of the soul into the sublunary regions, and its regression from it initiate the mystic, or him who is admitted to the arcane sacred rites, in a place which they denominated a cavern. In fact, literally, they were initiated in caves. For as Eubulus says, some quotation from another authority, Zoroaster was the first who was consecrated in the neighboring mountains of Persia, a spontaneously produced cave, florid and having fountains in honor of Mithra. Remember, Mithra is the deity that's worshipped in the Mithraic mysteries. The maker, and so this is how we also know he's talking about the Mithraic mysteries. Oh, here's Mithra now. In honor of Mithra, the maker and father of all things. A cave, according to Zoroaster, or at least in this case attributed to Zoroaster, bearing a resemblance of the world, which was fabricated by Mithra. But the things contained in the cavern being arranged according to commensurate intervals were symbols of the mundane elements and climate. So the cave represents the universe. Then you're initiated in the mysteries within that cave, and that reflects on the larger world symbolically, you see. So just a moment, let me close the window. Someone's running this very loud machine outside. Okay, and then there's some more interesting. He then interprets all the different elements of this passage from Homer in terms of different allegories for different types of elements of Platonic philosophy. He then says a few interesting things about evocation of spirits and magic, which I want to just mention as we're looking at this text because it relates to our own practice. So it says here at the number 5, let me make sure I'm doing this correctly. Taryn, could you read here where it says, it is necessary, therefore, that souls, and I'll tell you when to stop.
It is necessary, therefore, that souls, whether they are corporeal or incorporeal, while they attract to themselves body, and especially such as are about to be bound to blood and moist bodies, should verge to humidity and be corporealized in consequence of being drenched in moisture. Hence, the souls of the dead are evocated by their effusion of bile and blood. And souls that are lovers of body, by attracting a moist spirit, condense this humid vehicle like a cloud. For moisture condensed in the air constitutes a cloud. But the pneumatic vehicle being condensed in these souls becomes visible through an excess of moisture. And among the number of these, we must reckon those apparitions of images which, from a spirit colored by the influence of imagination, present themselves to mankind. But
okay, so here we go. Now, isn't that the most interesting description of evocation of spirits, just basically exactly the same way we do it today, right? And which is that you get some fumigations going, and then as the cloud of smoke is going up, you can, like a kind of Rorschach, your imagination will be able to project into and see the image of the spirit, the daimon within the cloud of vapor. And here we have that exact idea here in this ancient text where he's saying, well, these aerial daimons, these spirits, they have bodies form of these humid vapors. And so that it's like they have a body made up of, like we have a physical body made up of flesh. The aerial demons have bodies made up of like watery vapors in the air. And that's also why in the allegory of the cave, the waters from the tides that are flowing in and out of the cave represent the divine forms, because they're again this humidification that gives the vital impetus to life, just like the forms that infuse in matter, that likewise the forms take on a body through a kind of humidification, and are therefore able to take on form. I just think this is a really fascinating this is a really fascinating chapter. Now, there's also a further very interesting mention here. Let me find it. Yes, where it says number 6 here. And it says, this world then is sacred and pleasant to souls who have now proceeded into nature and to, oh, there's this reference to this thing called natal demons. Okay, so this is a reference to the higher and divine self, the holy guardian angel, is in Neoplatonism sometimes called the natal daimon because it's assigned to the soul. There's a higher daimon that's assigned to the superintendence of the soul at its moment of generation. It's assigned to it by the divine hierarchy, the divine governance of the universe. And I just want to point out right here in Porphyry, you have a reference to that. You have a reference to that doctrine. So here's our not only evocation of spirits, basically kind of the way we think of it and the way Crowley writes about it, but also the doctrine of the higher and divine self that is the goal of theurgy to get into communication with. And if you do that, then the world is sacred and pleasant because you've harmonized yourself with the spiritual forms that give order and coherence to reality, as opposed to the innately chaotic form of matter as such. So through a kind of self-spiritualization, you reconnect to the ground of being, which then gives meaning and purpose to your life, just exactly the way that the true will, which is communicated by the holy guardian angel, gives meaning and purpose to the magician's trajectory through the body of heaven as a star in the company of stars. So again, it's all here in these ancient texts. All the stuff the Golden Dawn was doing that's at the basis of Thelemic magic, it's all in these texts. Okay, then let's go to page 48. I'm going to skip actually to, in the interest of time, to keep on track because we've got some more to cover. There's obviously always more to talk about with these texts. What I want to skip to, though, is the end here, because if you remember, there's this olive branch that is hanging over the entrance to the cave. And this is a symbol of Minerva or Athena, the goddess of wisdom. And so it represents that this relates to the mysteries, that this is an initiatory metaphor. And what Porphyry does is he ends his account with what's called an emblematic image, which is he imagines, here where I've got my cursor, he says, on this account too, he says, a seat under the olive at the entrance to the cave is proper to Ulysses. So he's imagining this kind of tableau where, okay, let's have Odysseus then seated in front of the cave under this olive branch. Okay, like you'd have like on a coin or a talisman, something you might look at or visualize. And then this would be emblematic of the mysteries. It's just represented by this allegory of the cave. And then that magically activates your nous to a kind of your reason to a similitude with these spiritual things. And then it transports you, it energizes your soul into a closer union with the divine. So he says, a seat under the olive is proper to Ulysses as to one who implores divinity and would appease his natal daimon with a suppliant branch. Okay, and then here's the higher and divine self. So it's like he takes this olive branch and he uses it as an emblem, like a symbol that's being used in one of the mysteries, right? So in like the Eleusinian mysteries, there's this sheaf of wheat that one of the priests carries or shows the initiate during the climax of the sacrifice that's occurring, where they're pouring libations or whatever they're doing. We don't know exactly what occurred in the initiatory ritual, but it's some kind of basic either animal sacrifice or pouring of libations to the deities, where they're being invoked through a prayer, some oration, and then there's these what Iamblichus calls synthemata, these symbols that are shown, like a sheaf of wheat that represents the cycle of the seasons, or so again, it's the allegory of this kind of one-to-one correlation between the initiate, the myth of the gods, and then their harmonious relation to that divine milieu. And in this case, the olive branch signifying wisdom, initiation, and the mysteries. Odysseus is the type of the initiate who goes on this hero's journey before he, this Campbellian hero's journey before he returns home to Ithaca, having undergone this initiation. And then this appeases and integrates him with his higher and divine genius. And so then he's the recipient, he's the type of the magician possessed of gnosis. And then he completes the text here at the end. Joseph, if you could read this last paragraph, it's numbered 18.
Sure. It must not, however, be thought that interpretations of this kind are forced, nothing more than the conjectures of ingenious men. But when we consider the great wisdom of antiquity and how much Homer excelled in intellectual prudence and in an accurate knowledge of every virtue, it must not be denied that he has obscurely integrated the images of things of a more divine nature in the fiction of a fable. For it would not have been possible to devise the whole of this hypothesis unless the figment had been transferred to an appropriate meaning from established truths. But reserving the discussion for this for another treatise, we shall here finish our explanation of the present cave of the nymphs.
Okay. And this, of course, is where Porphyry is, in a sense, wrong, which is that this really is an interpretation that doesn't, in fact, directly represent the intention of the author, that there's been a new or fresh historical interpretation in terms of Platonism that's been, the text has been interpreted in terms of. And this is what readers always do, and there's nothing wrong with that. But this idea that truth is just one or single, and there's this direct correlation between interpretation and object, and it's this fixed truth that you know, and then that's it, and there's no ambiguity. This is what in the 20th century, the philosopher Jacques Derrida calls logocentrism. And it's very basic to, it's basically an idea that in a way Plato kind of invents. This idea that this thing called metaphysics, this philosophical obsession that philosophy needs to find the truth, the one truth. And Plato is concerned that Greek philosophy has instead been going in this other, more pluralistic direction, represented by the sophists, where rhetoric is not concerned with discerning absolute and unchanging truth that's absolute, but has instead become a means for persuasion in a more shifting, contextual, motivated, complex world. And Friedrich Nietzsche comes along later, and he says it's the sophists actually who have it right. And as modern people, we should look back not to Plato's myth of the one truth, but we should instead look to the realization of the sophists that truth is diverse and mutable and malleable and open to dialogue and debate, and the complexities of the soupy complexities of the melting pot of human experience. And that if we want to talk about truths with a lowercase t in a practical, pragmatic sense, that emerges from the dialectic, from the dialogue of language and of a kind of social, multicultural encounter, and can't just be superimposed from outside because somebody's figured out, they claim, what truth was a capital T is, and now they're going to come in this kind of totalitarian way and impose that on everybody. And so the history of modernity can be interpreted as this tug of war between these two possible understandings of the truth: pragmatic relativism versus this Platonic demand for absolutes. And I think Crowley is on the side of Nietzsche in this sense. And so Thelema is, by insisting on the uniqueness of each hadith, unit of existence, what Crowley calls each point event, having and insisting on the importance and the relevance to the larger social conversation of the eon of everything that could be contributed from all of the uniqueness of each point of view, that Crowley is also with the sophists in this way. So in a way, we could see Thelema as a way to try to have draw out this kind of initiatory potential of Neoplatonism, but season it with some skeptical sophism to blunt this rough edge of almost this kind of totalitarian element, Platonism, and therefore make it more useful. So in particular, opposed to what Derrida, and we'll have more to say about this next week when we're looking at the Sefer Yetzirah, but in ancient times, there's a kind of imminent difference to logocentrism, which is, you could say, the style of rabbinical discourse in Jewish exegetical literature, which is much more in contrast to the Greek logos and the obsession with the absoluteness and the unity of truth. Jewish textuality is more open to a pluralistic dialogue between sometimes irreconcilable viewpoints that are nevertheless part of a community of discourse, where all of the parts of that discourse, in their very differences from each other, are contributing to a understanding of the spirituality of lived human life. And this is, of course, contextualized in Torah observance, halakhic, all these things that you do to in your family life, like kosher observances, when you eat meals, when you get together to study Torah and pray, and the way that these practices can be theurgic, that they sacralize your experience. And yet the rabbinic discourse lacks the same kind of obsession with the unity of truth, which then also becomes a Christian totalitarianism. And again, in the medieval period, there's this kind of Jacques Lacan calls this difference in opposition to logocentrism. What this is an openness to the way that ultimate meaning is deferred, hence difference, where there's a kind of slippage inherent to the relationship between the symbol or sign and what it signifies, so that that's open to multiple interpretations. Your relationship with that can grow and become more complex. And this kind of frankly Jewish Kabbalistic way of, but also rabbinical way of having this more flexible relationship towards language and meaning, then in modern times gets reintroduced into philosophy as a kind of structuralist criticism of the Platonic sense of how language works or meaning should work. And you have the development of symbolism in place, the concept of the symbol in place of the allegory. So one way we could interpret this is to say that in modern times, textuality, particularly in the novel, but also in poetry and also in philosophy, there's a shift from the allegory to the symbol, that the function of metaphor begins to shift. And let me show you something here. This is from Paul de Man, who's a text called The Rhetoric of Romanticism from 1984, talking about this shift from allegory to symbolization. Taryn, could you read this paragraph?
In the history of Western literature, the importance of the image as a dimension of poetic language does not remain constant. One could conceive of an organization of this history in terms of the relative prominence and the changing structure of metaphor. The most recent change, remote enough to be a part of history, takes place towards the end of the 18th century and coincides with the advent of Romanticism. In a statement of which equivalences can be found in all European literatures, Wordsworth reproaches Pope for having abandoned the imaginative use of figural diction in favor of a merely decorative allegorization.
So the point here is that Pope wanted his poetry to be allegorical. That's what he wants to do. And Wordsworth is coming along and is saying, the problem with his poetry is that all he's doing is allegory. She should do this other thing called the imaginative symbol. And what's happened is that there's been a transition in poetry where now poets in Romantic poetry are trying to do something different with their poetic diction than poets of the previous generation have done. But this has now become so central to their concern of what they think poetry is that they've lost connection with what the agenda of poetry was before them. Keep going, Taryn.
Meanwhile, the term imagination steadily grows in importance and complexity in the critical as well as in the poetic texts of the period. This evolution in poetic terminology, of which parallel instances could easily be found in France and in Germany, corresponds to a profound change in the texture of poetic diction. The change often takes the form of a return to a greater concreteness, a proliferation of natural objects that restores to the language the material substantiality which had been partially lost. At the same time, in accordance with a dialectic that is more paradoxical than may appear at first sight, the structure of the language becomes increasingly metaphorical, and the image, be it under the name of symbol or even of myth, comes to be considered as the most prominent dimension of the style.
Okay, so symbol replaces allegory. And he says a return to a greater concreteness, a proliferation of natural objects. What he means is that poets start to write poetry about their immediate day-to-day experience again, rather than writing poetry about in the form of a more heroic diction where it's this allegory about knights roaming around in forests having allegorical adventures where the adventures they're having represent like different virtues. Okay, like Spenser's The Fairy Queen, for example, but that's typical of medieval poetry going all the way back. And what Paul de Man is saying is that with Romanticism, poets start to write about their personal experience. And this becomes a symbol for the spiritual meaning of life, that no longer requires this scaffolding of allegoresis that, or rather this shifts to a different mode. So in other words, another way to put this would be, whereas the allegory stages an encounter with the sacred domain of a human independent reality of cosmic nature and divine, the symbol derives its significance from being a self-referential creative event of human language, like the way a Wallace Stevens poem or a modernist poet is about the event of poetry itself, to the point where descriptive narrative of the usual trappings of poetic imagery disappears and the beauty of language or the world of immediate experience becomes its own spiritual event. So the French literary critic and philosopher Maurice Blanchot, in this essay called The Secret of the Golem, which again relates back to this Jewish understanding of symbolism, which we're not going to have too much time to talk about this week, but we'll cover it in depth next week when we're looking at the Sefer Yetzirah. So in these passages from The Secret of the Golem by Maurice Blanchot, Joseph, if you could read these two quotations.
Allegory develops the tangled vibration of its circles very far, without changing its level, conformable to an abundance that would be called horizontal. It keeps itself inside the limits of measured expression, representing, though something that is expressed or represented, some other thing that could be directly expressed.
Okay, so it's like a direct metaphor. The cave stands for the cosmos. The waters stand for the forms in relation to matter, one-to-one correlation. The symbol, on the other hand, is more open-ended. It stands for the mystery of existence itself. Go ahead and read this next quotation.
The symbol wants to jump outside of the sphere of language in all its forms. Through symbol, then there is a leap, a change of level, sudden and violent change. There is an exaltation, there is falling, a passage not from one meaning to another, from a modest meaning to a vaster richness of significations. But to that which is other, to that which seems other than all possible meanings. Symbol does not mean anything, expresses nothing. It only makes present by making us present to it. A reality that escapes all other capture and seems to rise up. They are prodigiously close and prodigiously far away, like a foreign presence. If symbol is a wall, then it is like a wall that, far from opening wide, not only becomes more opaque, but with a density, a thickness, and a reality so powerful and so exorbitant that it transforms us, changes instantly the sphere of our ways and habits, takes us away from all actual and latent knowledge, makes us more malleable, moves us, turns us around, and exposes us by this new freedom to the approach of another space.
Okay, so what's going on here is that the symbol does more than facilitate the perpetuation of the social significance of the already established usages of a given historical period. The symbol points beyond itself to an ultimately human potential that's in excess of any given ideological order. It points towards our own ultimate freedom as human beings to make meaning itself. It points to will to power. It signifies a surplus dimension of signification beyond the allegorical space of already understood interlinguistic social practices. The best example of this in fiction would be if allegory would be represented by something like, say, Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress, where all the different characters stand for one or another relatively straightforward, figuration of Protestant theology. So again, it's the traditional allegory. The kind of symbol that Blanchot is talking about, the magical symbol, that's represented by Herman Melville's Moby Dick, by the great white whale, by the ambiguity of the symbolism of the great white whale, which structures the whole narrative of this huge baggy novel that turns out to be about just the whole of human existence, the whole mystery of life. And the answer to that mystery is ultimately a kind of, it can't be ultimately fixed or determined, because the whole point is that human freedom is what creates meaning in the first place. And so it's what's so fascinating about a book like Moby Dick is that it is radically post-theistic. It's human existence itself and its mysterious magical power has taken the place of the personal monotheistic God of medieval traditional Osirian religion, who controls history and must be obeyed and propitiated. That for Melville, that is evaporated, but it's not replaced by some kind of boring secular drudgery. Quite the contrary, precisely the clearing away of these Osirian myths has opened this profound space to more directly encounter the primordial mystery of human existence itself. And I guess what I'm getting at, before I'll open to questions, I think in another 5 or 10 minutes, what I'm getting at here is that in Thelemic magic, the function of the holy guardian angel is this symbolic function, is this opening up to the depths of the ground of being of our own human potential in excess of any given ideological order is given by the vulgar common consensus reality around us, that we innately already transcend those limits, and that by using the magical symbol and using magical symbolism of this type within our rituals, of viewing what we're doing not just as a kind of moving beyond the sort of straightforward one-to-one allegoresis of traditional Platonism, we can complete this kind of transcription of ourselves into what it means to be a spiritual initiate in the conditions of modern life. And that the symbolism of the knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel is a way to both appropriate all of this useful technology from classical allegoresis, but then update it in a self-critical way for our current modern condition. And that, I think, is the usefulness of this distinction between symbol and allegory, to understand both what we're drawing from, but also the way that we might want to critically transform it to move it into the space of our current experience. And this is then a way to think the think the way that something like the Platonic Logos can be understood in a post-metaphysical context by following through this transcendental turn in philosophy, and in the same process reappropriate the creative wellsprings of our own existence. Anyway, let me I've got a little bit over 3 here, so let me pause and see if there's any questions that anybody has that we can have a little bit of discussion here in the last 20 minutes or so. Last 20 minutes or so of the class. Taryn, any thoughts? I don't know if Joseph's still on the line.
I think he's having connectivity issues because he keeps
Okay.
bouncing in and back. I don't know. This one's an interesting one for me. I'm definitely kind of chewing on this a little bit more. I don't quite have a question formulated.
That's good. That's fine. Some of this is a little. Let me give kind of a concrete example, maybe. So I think that Aleister Crowley in particular, that his writings are very open to this kind of this difference of this kind of slippage of meaning, so that when he uses magical correspondences, he's keen to create these ways that the meaning will slip beyond what you might immediately think that it would mean. He often uses this as a way to kind of indicate this space of queer jouissance, for example, to kind of esoterically allude to that or include that space of experience that isn't normally representable, especially in his time. And he can use symbolism, not just allegory, but this, so in a way that the space of the symbol includes for him a certain type of queer experience that wouldn't normally be represented by this kind of one-to-one correlation of allegory, but he can kind of open up to that space of signification in excess of what's normally permissibly representable by doing that. And I would contrast Crowley's use of metaphor as symbol to someone who's more of a straightforward user of traditional allegory. The best example of this would be someone like Paul Foster Case, for example, where he also has a kind of common grounding in the Golden Dawn system of correspondences, particularly the tarot correspondences. Crowley also uses these. They're kind of common language these two magicians have in common. But in Case's case, it's more of when he's analyzing particular symbols, particularly in relationship to how I'll break it down in terms of particular tarot cards or whatever. It's more or less a straight allegorical one-to-one correlation with certain, like with Porphyry and Platonism. In the case of Paul Foster Case, there's certain theosophical doctrines that he has in mind. So he'll say, so for example, when he interprets the Rosicrucian manifestos in True and Faithful, the true and invisible Rosicrucian order, he has a whole interpretation of the Rosicrucian manifesto in there, the Fama Fraternitatis. So he interprets this more or less as an allegory for the Golden Dawn magical system and the tarot correspondences and so forth. Even though it's pretty clear from a reading of from a historical contextual reading of the manifestos, that when they have these different letters, like the different, like there's the book M and the book this and the that these refer to Latin and not Hebrew, because the author is a Christian Lutheran, and so they're more likely to. So the letter M probably refers to the Latin word mundi, meaning world. So it's the book of the world, or the meaning the book that gives you all the secrets of natural magic, because you're able to know what all the astrological correspondences with the different plants or metals are, so you can then do astral magic to manipulate things. So, but Case will see that, he says, oh, letter M, that means the Hebrew letter mem, and then but he actually thinks that the author of the Fama Fraternitatis intended this. Now, and that's kind of the problem with allegory. It's too unilateral. Whereas I'm perfectly fine with Paul Case interpreting the Fama Fraternitatis that way. It's just that it's clear that the author didn't intend that, and that's fine. This can be Case's own interpretation, but he wouldn't acknowledge that. And I don't see why there's any reason why, as magicians, we shouldn't acknowledge when we're interpreting something that it's our interpretation, because you see what I mean. And but for traditional Platonic allegory, they want to find the truth, and so they have to include this element of, Homer was a Platonist, but Plato's like, 500 years or something later, and so he can't be a Platonist. So how would you? It doesn't make sense. And right. So, but of course, it doesn't need to make sense, because it shouldn't need to matter that the author intended a particular interpretation, because of course, from the point of view of Derrida's difference, anyone can come at any time and find something new in the text, because language always has new meanings when new people read it. And that's just a basic function of language. There's nothing weird or wrong about that. But the Platonist is concerned, they're anxious about that. They have to fix meaning. And this is the logocentric totalitarian kind of tendency. Whereas Nietzsche's will to power is more open, hermeneutically open. Anything goes, basically. You just have to pragmatically make sense to some reader. And that's enough. That's fine, because that's what reading is, basically. And that doesn't mean that you shouldn't read historically, contextual, whatever. But that's just more information for then, your own informed take on what ultimately it's going to mean for you. Like with the rabbis interpreting, the Torah and the Talmud, almost anything goes. It's just, it has to meaningfully relate to what, the particular set of issues are that they're trying to, figure out to make their observance meaningful, their practice of mitzvot. And, if you can find some way to relate that back to some Torah citation, you're good to go. That's great. That'll work fine. It doesn't have to be this, and if the voice of God shows up in your Beit Midrash and is like, no, that's the wrong interpretation, the rabbis can turn to God and say, you can't tell us that. That, look, we'll cite Deuteronomy at you. The Torah is not in heaven. There's your proof text. That means you can't tell us what the right interpretation is. So don't show up here, voice of God, and tell us how to interpret this. Right? That's unthinkable from a Greek Platonic point of view. Okay. But that's rabbinic Judaism. That's fine. Mm-hmm. Okay. So, and that goes. That's great. And I'm saying that Thelema is with the rabbis here.
Yeah.
And Paul Case is more like Porphyry, where he's like, no, I'm going to figure out what the one correct, true interpretation is, and that's how it is. And it's like, no, this is a text that was an allegory of politics that were going on right before the 30 Years' War, where there was this Protestant prince who became an elector in the Holy Roman Empire because they inherited this area in Bohemia. And it was like, oh, now maybe the Holy Roman Empire is going to be is going to go Protestant, and that will bring this new revival of the spirit of the Reformation to Central Europe, and we can be more free. And then everything goes wrong, and the 30 Years' War breaks out, and it's a big mess. But the manifestos are about, oh, suddenly there's this political opening, and there's going to be this new Reformation, and that's what the manifestos are about. And of course, for us, that allegory no longer applies, because the political situation has changed, and that's not our situation anymore. But that's okay, because we can interpret it in terms of our own symbols and metaphors. And the Fama Fraternitatis can signify for us just as much as to somebody when it came out. We just have to reinterpret it. And that's fine, because all texts have to be reinterpreted to meet new circumstances. And that should be just fine, because that's how texts work, is what Derrida is saying. And he's pushing back against this Platonic tendency where it's like, no, the text means this and that's it, and then we're fixed, and then the meaning of the Bible is faith and obedience to Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, and anybody who doesn't believe that is going to hell. We have to punish them, and and then it's just your head blows up, and it's some person shouting, at Sproul Plaza in Berkeley, and they're just consumed with hate, and you walk by there, it's like, whoa, that's not how you have to interpret texts. That's not what you have to do. So there's this other more magical, open. So anyway,
as you say, it has to still contain a self-reference of this is how we're interpreting now, and maybe maybe it isn't necessarily relevant or contextualized to the politics of the time. Dan McClellan's a big biblical scholar who often is pointing out how modern mores are not necessarily applicable to the Bible and vice versa. You know what I mean?
That's right.
Like that sometimes even to a negative extent, right? Like we think of like the modern age as being really progressive or whatever. But he actually points out that very often homophobic readings of the Bible, for example, are more modern. They it's not necessarily like rooted in the text, or if
Sure.
it is, it's very, very contextualized to a particular time period.
A really good example of that is a passage that's the beginning of the Epistle to the Romans by Paul, where he says, well, sodomites deserve death. Okay, but sodomite doesn't mean homosexual in the sense that we mean it today.
Right.
It means an unvirtuous person in a Roman civic context. Right. And it doesn't even particularly refer to anything in particular. It just means a vicious person.
Right.
And doesn't really have a correlation to any particular physical, what we would call sexuality, because sexuality, again, in a personalized sense, doesn't exist then.
Right. Exactly.
Right. People don't have a sexual orientation in ancient times. These are all personalized. People don't experience their sexuality in a personalized identity political way.
Right.
In ancient times. That's just not, they don't exist as bourgeois individuals. In ancient, that's just not how they experience themselves as a person. And so when we look back at these texts and would try to superimpose those systems of values, we're not reading contextually, and then we get it wrong. And so then you have these screaming evangelicals holding up this Bible quote, sodomites deserve death, as if, Paul is saying that, everybody queer should be put in some concentration camp. And it's like, that's not what the text means at all. But you can't tell them that because they think they're reading it literally, but that's not how to read. There is no, it's in fact an extremely impoverished way to read any text, is to read it that way. There's this more hermeneutically complex way to read, which involves a number of elements. I'm just touching on one of them right now, which is this idea of the symbol. There's lots of other ways we could package this. We could talk about historicism, or we could talk endlessly about the way that modern subjectivity is different from the way ancients experienced themselves in the world, and how that has to be kind of incorporated when you're reading these more ancient texts. We could also talk about the way that certain values of agrarian societies just can't be our values anymore.
Right.
Because the type of life world that they existed in isn't our experience anymore, and that changes what it means to be a person. That personhood is itself historical. And so to treat being a human being as some kind of absolute that is a fixed point of reference, that then you could take your own subjectivity and read any text and know what it means without there being some more, complex historical mediation built into that. That's also extremely misleading. And so I guess I just it's just with this class, I'm just trying to make the conversation just of how we interpret the texts and histories that are part of our magical tradition, because this is a thousands of year old tradition. Just make that a little bit more sophisticated, because there's always this tendency to regress or revert to a certain type of Puritan, Protestant, Christian fundamentalism, because that's so basic to the cultural matrix of the United States.
Well, and it's popular because it's simple, right? It does not require as much thinking and learning, and it asks so little of people. I
That's
think
right. Fanaticism is easy.
right.
It feels good to hate, and it's just that these are so impoverished that you can't get anywhere with them, and so you just dig yourself deeper and deeper in this hole based on this kind of addiction to this immediately satiating thing that doesn't get you anywhere, doesn't do anything,
Right.
creates no understanding that means anything. And so you wind up on the street corner screaming at people, and it doesn't do any work socially. It's not. And so magical practice, I think, is bound up with this thing called hermeneutics, which is this more hermeneutics from Hermes, the god of magic and writing and discourse, the patron deity of magic. The figure of Hermes Trismegistus is associated also with this deity, this ideal that there can be this more complex and sophisticated way that we can understand ourselves, that is then bound up with the very problematic of the true will itself, as this attempt to liberate ourselves from the vulgarity of the life world that surrounds us, so that we can live in a more creatively fulfilling way. Just to put that in the simplest possible terms. The most formal and abstract, meaning I haven't actually said anything that anybody in particular is doing. I haven't really said anything, but I'm saying this is like, for me, the basic framework, the basic horizon to understand something like Thelemic magic in a way that doesn't just allow it to collapse back into some kind of fundamentalism, which to me is useless.
Right. I wanted to give Joseph a chance to pipe up and ask a question if he wanted, before we're out of time.
Yes.
I don't really have any questions. Just I've been thinking of Dante had his four interpretations of text, which was the literal, allegorical, moral, and anagogical. And the anagogical is always really hard for me to understand. Like, I guess like the spiritual, but it could be this personal spiritual, I guess, interpretation that maybe transcends the, I don't know, the more fundamental dogma, I guess.
Yes, it's an element of what you could call the symbol that is implicit in the ancient tradition of allegory. So they're aware that there might be these other dimensions of interpretation. And so even if the focus is more on this kind of more one-to-one theological, there's this reaching towards a more transcendent space of signification that's less fixed and obvious. So an example of that would be in Aristotle's Metaphysics. He defines the distinction between physics and metaphysics, where physics is concerned with the particular details of beings, plural, whereas metaphysics is concerned with the being of those beings. So in a similar way, you could say that the symbol is concerned with the ultimate ground of meaningfulness that is the basis for any particular more immediate definition or one-to-one allegory or metaphorical signification that you might have. So that in the novel Moby Dick both is a character in the novel. It's this white whale that appears, at the end and sinks the ship. Spoilers, the ship gets sunk at the end in this chase with the whale. Anyway. And but at the same time, it is this reference to something that's completely transcendent, which is this transcendental turn where it's not just the particular significances in the life world, but philosophically you can become aware that there's this horizon that imparts signification, or the function or the ability to signify itself, that is this more ontological level rather than the merely ontical appearances that undergirds. It's something like what Martin Heidegger calls being with a capital B. And this can be a post-metaphysical concept. It doesn't have to have anything to do with the supernatural reality or some other world. It can be inherent to the phenomenal life world of human beings and are bound up in our own existence, but it still has this profound ambiguity to it that can't just be pinned down, as it were. And so it then has this magical function.
Yeah, man, it seems like it's kind of like when Crowley talks about the Kabbalah as like a filing cabinet. It has a very, I don't know, personal meaning, I guess, to each of the Sephiroth. And
that's right. We have to each come up with our own Kabbalah. And so we're not required to follow the interpretation of anybody else. There is this pre-existing tradition, but we have to come up with our own halakhic reading. We have to come up with our own, like we're one of the rabbis in the Talmud, we have to insert our own voice and say, well, that's all well and good what this person says or that person says, but now here's my contribution to the dialogue. Here's my spin on it, because it also means this other thing that I just came up with today that I was looking at it and I was like, oh, this means this too. And that's part of the conversation. It's part of the dialectic. And so that's what keeps the practice alive and makes what we're doing relevant to our current situation. And so unlike the fundamentalists who just worships the past and then they're just in complete confusion in the present, maybe we can be more skillful in the way that we use magic and the symbolic function in magic to orient ourselves towards life. Anyway, any last comments or thoughts before we get to 3:30? We're going to sign off for this week. Okay, great. It's 3:30. And so next week, we'll look at the Sefer Yetzirah. Love is the law, love under will. Thanks, everybody, for joining us this week.